Our next panel is the state of venture capital in defense tech. It will be moderated by Sille Petai, who is fund manager and management board member of SmartCap, Estonian state-owned investment company. Please welcome to the stage Sille Petai, Erik Schlesinger, Klaus Hommels, and Philip Lockwood.
Well done as always. I'll catch you later, amigo.
Hello everyone, hi all innovators, startup founders, investors and ecosystem players. And welcome to listening our session on the state of venture capital in defense tech. So here we're going to talk about dual-use startups from investors' perspective. I'm excited to share the stage and hear your views, who are one of the key people in European defense investment scene. Erik Schlesinger, founder of European Defense Investor Network, Klaus Hommels, partner at Lakestar, and Phil Lockwood from NATO HQ in Brussels. Please introduce yourself to get a better understanding, a big context about your professional highlights, different hats that you're wearing, or important facts that we should know.
Shall I go?
Yeah, you should go.
Hi, everyone. All right, there's feedback. My name is Phil Lockwood. I work at NATO headquarters in Brussels on the international staff, and James Apathrai, who spoke earlier today, is my boss. So I'm going to try and follow in his footsteps, and that's a tall order. I'm originally from Canada, and I have lived in the UK and in the United States, as well as in Europe. My background is first and foremost as a special forces operator in the Canadian military. And so that time and that experience in my life really gave me the perspective of what it was like to work with cutting-edge technology and to see that happen in the field in an operational context. And it also made me even more determined than ever to try and address things and make sure that all of our military personnel have the ability to use and to leverage great technology to be able to keep themselves safe. And so for me, that's always been a bit of a constant in terms of my career. When I finished being on active duty, I became a lawyer. And I practiced internationally, working especially in the tech-related space and field, looking at companies like Google and Snapchat and Facebook and Spotify, and thinking about global markets in the technology world and the technology space, and trying to understand what really creates and crafts and positions markets. And so 3 years ago, I came to NATO and had an amazing opportunity with the creation of this new innovation unit, which is all about deep technologies. And we have this fundamental recognition at NATO that there has become a disconnect between the world of government and defense and security, and we are no longer the primary drivers of some of the tremendous innovation that is happening today in the commercial sector and the commercial markets. And so our task has been, how do we actually bridge this gap between the defense and security world that is still in many ways rooted in a Cold War mindset and mentality, different ways of doing project management, and very dense and heavy procurement and regulations. And on the flip side, we have this amazing, agile, creative scene, particularly in Europe, but across the entire alliance, that is really driving fundamental change in technology. And once upon a time, defense used to be that primary driver, and we're not really the ones anymore. And so how can we actually bridge that gap, communicate, speak the same language, and be able to leverage that? And so it's been a wild ride over the last 3 years as we've created Diana and the NATO Innovation Fund, and I think that's why we're here today.
Yes.
Yeah, wonderful. Maybe I follow. So my name is Klaus Hommels. I'm the founder of Lakestar. Have been investing all my life. Since 2000, and so I've seen many cycles, have been many technical innovations that shape the industry, that shape the culture. And I have been under the impression, especially in the last years, that starting with very dominant technologies, they have an influence on our everyday's life. So let's say social media has 3 hours usage with teens, so that means if the teens become 24, they have used it something like 11,000 hours. If a working day has 8 hours, that was 7 working years. So it means that technology suddenly defines at a 24, 25-year-old 7 working years of occupation, spending time, getting influenced, and changing culture, changing values. So I became more and more concerned with technology influencing our great cultural values in Europe. And this started with economic aspects, or cultural aspects as just described. But of course, there are technologies that are also system relevant, for our sovereignty, and our defensibility, capability to defend ourselves. So for me, it was a very natural thing, that I follow my passion and my conviction that we do need to get our act together to invest and to foster technologies that enhance our defense capabilities. And as you might not know, but as a normal VC, you're not in a position to fund these kind of innovations because you have investors, which often comes from charities or from churches. And so in our normal contracts, it is excluded that we invest in those kind of situations, clearly leaving a void and a necessity to come up with alternative financing sources for very, very important technologies to our security, our daily life, our safeguard of culture. So, and that's why I'm with full steam ahead passion into the NATO project, and I'm very happy that I am allowed to work alongside great guys like Philip and James.
I'm Eric Schlesinger. I'm the founder of the European Defense Investor Network, and the reason I founded this network is because I was really pissed off that there were not enough investors on the continent that were willing to actually step forward and say, we want to invest in technologies that are pushing the boundaries of those agreements that Klaus just mentioned. And by the way, those agreements include defense investments oftentimes in the same category as pornography, tobacco, and gambling. So just like to set the stage of how that's viewed. My background is originally I'm an engineer. I served as an intelligence officer based in the US and traveling around the world for many years. And then I transitioned into venture capital. I now live in Spain and organize this network and have my own fund called 201 Ventures based there, investing in the space as well.
Thank you. It's clear that we haven't really seen defense-related
I have a question. The acoustics is very bad, so can you speak a little bit up? Otherwise, I'm missing the question and would give awkward answers.
Can you hear me? Okay. Well, it's clear that we haven't seen defense-related technologies in VC fund portfolios in Europe. But what we have seen is that there are many startups that are exploring defense sector, but position themselves defense only. And when there is no dual use and commercial function to this technology, there's a limited number of government-owned end users and very complex procurement processes, right? And on top of that, you already described that defense-related technologies have been in exclusion lists for European investors among tobacco and gambling. Klaus, you have been a very active VC investor for many years in Europe. How do you describe the starting point? What has been the defense and dual-use investment scene in Europe for the last 10 or 20 years like?
Well, I think in the last 20 years, the investment scene of defense techs happens on one Wednesday, meaning it wasn't existent. So because, for a variety of reasons. A, there was no money to be invested, and it's clear for everybody, nobody will invest, no startup will found and get the idea to do something. Secondly, I think there's also like a cultural acceptance which has changed with the war in the Ukraine, so that people suddenly say, like, there is a necessity, the ESG, the S is not only for social but also for security. So the acceptance and the social acknowledgement of a journey that an entrepreneur undertakes has become not only accepted but also appreciated now. And that made a whole lot of a difference for the likelihood of entrepreneurs to really drilling into these kind of topics.
Phil, you just completed a very thorough research and did a lot of background work to prepare for the NATO Innovation Fund. And you mapped the situation, tested the cases with top VCs globally to crack the challenge that we are having here. What do you think would have been the biggest hurdles behind the struggle for defense startups in Europe?
I mean, I think Klaus has hit probably the biggest problem most accurately in the sense that investors and institutionals have historically prevented the flow of capital into startups that might want to view defense as their market. And that's a huge, massive impact. But I think there's maybe even something even more fundamental than the question of defense and where does it stand philosophically for Europe. A lot of the technology that we're interested in from startups today have hardware-related components, or generally, I would categorize a good chunk of it as being deep technology. And deep tech in itself is something that's struggled and has struggled historically in Europe for quite a long time. And I think we're only now just starting to see a shift and a change in the deep tech ecosystem in this particular continent. And the numbers up to now, today, have been actually incredibly stark. The US outspends in terms of investment in the deep tech space. China outspends Europe in terms of investment into deep tech. The ecosystems here generally suffer and struggle in terms of hardware as being something that's very difficult. It features longer timelines. A lot of fund investors don't have the patience for it. And so what we've found historically is valuation of deep tech startups has suffered in general. And if you look at Europe versus the United States, there are incredibly significant changes in variance when it comes to valuations. And then we also look at capital allocation. There are many different deep tech funds in the United States that have flourished and have shown tremendous returns back to their investors. We are still looking for large deep tech funds to really emerge here in Europe. You know, I think there was a wave in the 1990s, and there's maybe one fund left that has been able to survive since the 90s until now in the deep tech space. And currently in Europe, there's less than 5 funds that have over 300 million allocated specifically towards deep tech. That's a very, very small number when you think about the strategic need and the game-changing nature of deep tech and hardware-specific technologies.
You mentioned US. Eric, you have been at both sides of the ocean. And US is at a different place when we talk about defense industry and defense startups. But what makes US different and brings US to the forefront of defense-related deep technologies?
Part of it, and Klaus touched on this, I think there's a cultural question, one. And then second is time. It's really easy to forget that the US has had decades to practice this and work out all the issues. I mean, look back to the 60s and 70s, the venture capital industry as a thing started investing in defense. It was electronic intelligence and electronic warfare during the Cold War. That is what was the original venture capital. And so with decades of experience, you learn all the lessons and you work out all the failures and you get the sort of how the government works with these investors. And you see that now more and more with Silicon Valley and DC talking. And so there's an advantage there of having much more time, whereas the venture capital industry here is just a little bit younger and has started at a place that defense was not the sort of the match that was thrown on the fire. I think if I were to talk about the cultural aspect, so far in Europe it's been fits and starts. It's sort of like like walking home after a long night at the bar. You know, you take these lurches and you kind of have a step in the right direction, and then you take a lurch on the other side. And it's finally, I think, because of the clarity of the war now, especially, there's a much straighter path that I see in Europe. I'm seeing it in the European Defense Investor Network. As part of it is people who come from funds that actually they say, yeah, we don't invest in defense, and yet they're in the network, and so obviously they care. And they know that they have sort of handcuffs on from the limited partner agreements, but there is real interest. And so I'm very encouraged that it is starting to change.
That's true. Klaus, I'm coming back to you now because we have seen a global shift in VC flows to defense tech startups, and they have increased 6 times since 2020. But what do you think, what describes the current state of venture capital in defense industry in Europe?
So I think everybody is now thinking about how to do it. So in current fund documentations, you cannot change it. So the question is whether the current situation for the new funds that will be issued have different like deals concerning that sector. So, but that needs to start with maybe the composition of LPs. So if you want to do that, you actively exclude certain LPs that have more problems with the sector, and then you need to incorporate it into the rules of the limited partnership agreement in order to have this degree of freedom. So we do see some interpretations where people say, look, yes, I invest in the hardware of a drone, that's uncharted territory for investors because it's still not clear. So I hope that everybody or a lot of LPs get to the conclusion that it is a reasonable thing to do, a necessary thing to do, and that the interpretation becomes a little bit more encompassing these kind of sectors as well.
It seems like institutional investors are still trying to figure it out.
Yes.
But what is evident, and James already mentioned in his keynote speech, is that we have strategic competition getting stronger than ever. We have adversaries being more visible and powerful than ever. And the war in Ukraine is just, something that we cannot avoid. So what are the drivers behind the change, even if the institutional investors are not able to change so quickly? Klaus, you want to take it?
Yeah, look, so sometimes there are very visible moments that create an understanding out of a theoretical problem. Yeah, so because we have been living in decades of deterrence in Europe, and now suddenly we are living in an era of defense. That is a very different thing, and so the perception also with the success of the Ukrainians using technology has, to my perception, changed the attitude of the uniforms, so to say. When you are at the Munich Security Conference, you can clearly see that the likelihood and the pattern of thinking to allocate some of the normal budgets into technology is more there than it ever was. And if you then say, look, there's a cultural acceptance, there is a higher likelihood that gifted technology people deal with these problems. And then you say, look, we started with 2.5–3% GDP defense budgets, went down to 1.2, and now we're going up to like 2.5 again. And then we think like in perspective, we will have like 5–7% of that in technology. Then suddenly, for everybody, it's imaginable that these are 30–40 billion markets that didn't exist 3 years back. And now they will be there on the demand side, and there will be there also on the supply side, because with money, people find the ways into serving that need with technology. So I think this play where the supply and demand now has changed that significantly drives the ecosystem.
Eric, if you look among your investor network members, what kind of investors are dominating or actively investing in defense tech or dual-use companies in Europe right now?
It's all types, actually, and there's a few faces in this room. It's not probably a surprise to anybody that the Baltic states are very active here, as are any countries that have borders with Russia. The more interesting ones, though, are folks that I would categorize as previously thought of defense as investing in like ammunitions factories and very like things that are not traditional VC investments, and they've realized that defense technology is not just ammunitions and drones and submarines. It is real dual use kind of stuff, advanced encryption, semiconductor technologies. It's that realization. Once that switch flips, they're interested. And so we've seen everyone from traditional asset managers who are doing a little bit of crossover to angel investors, to what I would call tier one funds, household names if you're in the startup and venture community, to new upstart funds that are finding that this is a market that founders are excited to build for right now. To put numbers on it, the network started with 8 friends And it was 8 people that I just had a group chat with. And it's just grown one by one organically with no marketing to 73 now across 19 countries. And so it's encouraging to see that people are finding it and at least interested in knowing who else is out there. It only has 3 goals. And number 1 goal is to let investors see who else is in the room with them. Because before you'd invest in this space and you might go to like these, you go to a back room to talk about it. You don't go talk about it in public. And I found that to be stupid. It was totally non-efficient. And so to give investors a space to know who else is in the room, to see follow-on investors for deals, is finally happening. That's really encouraging.
But what are they looking for? What kind of technologies are they willing to invest in?
The best is a couple examples of recent ones. So there's a company that's doing a computer vision autonomy layer for military hardware. And you can think of looking into a vast field or an ocean and finding things like boats or people. But there's obvious commercial applications, right? To be able to maybe put that type of autonomy in this room and count how many people are here with the flows in and out. Another one would be advanced semiconductor manufacturing technology, so new types of lithography. A lot of things going on in the Eindhoven region because of ASML, and into Germany with Zeiss, of course. And a third one I'm seeing a lot lately is advanced encryption, so better implementations of fully homomorphic encryption, which right now is largely hardware limited, but if you're able to combine it with distributed computing and secure multi-party compute, you can actually maybe find some happy middle ground where you can actually do that stuff with existing hardware. And there's really cool applications, not just for defense, but in healthcare, to be able to share private healthcare data across traditional corporate borders by keeping it encrypted.
So now we know what the challenges are, what are the opportunities. And it's a good place to transition to you, Phil, because NATO has been developing an investment and innovation initiative for a few years by now. And NATO Innovation Fund, where James gave a sneak peek already to a €1 billion NATO Innovation Fund. It's going to be launched quite soon. Phil, maybe you can describe what's the mission and what's the ambition of NATO Innovation Fund, a more detailed level.
Sure. So the NATO Innovation Fund is something that's very unique. It is a very, very large fund. I mentioned before that there's less than 5 deep tech funds with over 300 million to them here in Europe. So at €1 billion, it makes it the biggest or one of the biggest deep tech funds here in Europe. So that's one element that's unique. It also happens to be a multi-sovereign VC fund. So it's the first time ever in VC that every single investor comes from a sovereign nation, which gives it a little bit of a unique flavor. But what we've really tried to do is to take this fund and take it outside of the government bureaucracy, to create it and structure it as a private entity, to give it the flexibility to look and to act like a market participant. And so what we really want to be able to do is to invest in the same mentality, under the same philosophy, the same market economic principles that private sector investors across Europe invest in. Because I think there was 100 billion invested in Europe last year. A €1 billion fund still isn't necessarily all that particularly big in the grand scheme of things. And so what we want to be able to do is to invest alongside other investors and to bring great investors from across the alliance on both sides of the ocean and to crowd that capital into the participating nations. There's 23 nations. Finland just recently joined just a couple of weeks ago, so we're thrilled to have them on board. And we want to be able to, there you go. We want to be able to crowd investment into European deep tech startups across all of the various regions, from the Nordics and the Baltics to the eastern flank, to the south, to Western Europe and the United Kingdom, and therefore act as a lighthouse and as a signal. And what NATO can really do is it brings together all of these different nations and their defense ministries and the defense spending, which is probably the most reliable market that we're going to see over the next 3 to 5 years. And if we can actually signal what the market needs and the problems are. Eric gave you a list just now of some really interesting technologies, but can we come together as NATO and say, hey, here's what we view to be some of our critical priorities over the next 5 years when it comes to things like energy transition, supply chain, securing our underwater infrastructure, these sorts of things. And then how can we basically provide a strategic demand signal and say, hey, the market's open, we're willing to buy. Can you invest now in these technologies, and can we give a little bit of a boost? And so the fund, even though it operates as a private entity and therefore doesn't have to deal with the same NATO bureaucracy that I get to day in and day out, it still has access to NATO. It gets the demand signals. It can work with our 6,000 scientists and technologies to look at this technology under the hood and validate it. It can get technology that's invested on into NATO operations and exercises so we can pressure test that. I really, really hope to see technology that has been built and developed here in Europe in the battle group here in Estonia within the next 2 years, and to really be able to identify amazing things that are going on, to pressure test that with operators and innovators together. And so by doing that as a €1 billion fund, we're able to send a really strong market signal. And I think, as maybe one last point, the fund has the ability to invest also in other deep tech funds. And some of that will be existing. There are a small number of pure deep tech funds already operating in Europe, and we want to be able to work alongside them as partners. But then the other aspect is we want to be able to help kickstart brand new deep tech funds from across the various regions. And so we'd like to see that come to fruition and success and help build this transatlantic ecosystem and work with things like the European Defence Investor Network.
Klaus, since you're one of the masterminds behind the strategy and vision, how would you comment the strategy and approach?
So I think the effort at the end cannot be underestimated for a variety of reasons, because it's the first time you have a multinational sovereign wealth fund with a clear aim. And so in order to really make the most out of it, we use that as a drag, and the accessibility to the ministries of defense as a catalyst to develop an ecosystem. So it is also, very, very heartwarming to see with which passion and which energy all of the different LPAC members that we have are really, they have sparkle in their eyes with this new task. Everybody, as if everybody had waited for it. And there are so many things with that you can do with this energy, starting to change procurement systems. Because you ordered a tank, it arrived 3 years later, so the procurement had 3 years' time to wake up. Yeah. So now you have a drone, you have a software, it needs to be employed right away. So with that energy, you have the very legitimate way to challenge these processes and change them. So, and for us, when we had the discussion, it is very important. It is a NATO thing, so it means that it needs to be represented, this effort, within all the member states. So that is why it's important I want to help develop the ecosystem there, so because it is a common effort from everybody, so we will have representations not only in a London ivory tower of this VC wisdom. No, we want to go into the different areas where the innovation happens, where you can create the proximity between innovation and the use. So, and I think this would have never been possible to jumpstart a movement like that without the common will of the passion, desire of the entire MODs of the NATOs.
So NATO Innovation Fund will be one of the key elements to pave a solid foundation for the next level, or bring European defense sector the next level. I'm going to ask the final question now from you, Phil, and it's about the desired state of defense tech in Europe and across NATO allies. And are we on the track to see defense unicorn in Europe?
Man, well, I think I hope we're going to be close to one soon. Maybe not a pure play defense company, but we do have this notion of dual use. So a startup that's providing both commercial technology as well as defense customers their work. I think with Helsing, we're probably going to see that sometime soon. But I'm really hoping to be able to see pure play defense unicorns as well. And one thing that I notice is the United States has been able to do that. There's about 7 or 8 defense tech unicorns. But there's one thing that's really interesting about them. Whether you look at Palantir or Shield AI or Anduril, these are all companies that are billionaire backed. And so they have someone who's incredibly wealthy that has been with them from the various beginnings. I mean, Rebellion is another one with Eric Schmidt and Peter Thiel. And the fact of the matter is, if you look at Helsing, that also happens to be backed by Daniel Ek, the Spotify co-founder. So what I'd like to see is we have a $1 billion fund. It's not a billionaire, but I'd love to be able to see the NATO Innovation Fund take a bold move and back some really ambitious startups here in Estonia, and across all of the alliance to be able to drive forward and see if we can generate game changers. And I think the market's there for that.
That's an awesome message to wrap the conversation up with, because I see as defense unicorns in Europe as future primes, because that's what we also need in Europe. The unicorns of defense will be future primes in Europe. So thank you so much for sharing the views. I hope you enjoyed the discussion and found something interesting for you. And let's give applause.
Thank you.
Thank you, Silla and the participants.